back to the Legacy Gambit. Today we have a very exciting episode where we get to talk about deck building, mana bases, and generally how to construct a legacy deck. And obviously it's not always me that's here. I'm obviously joined by my lovely co-host Sarah. Sarah, how are you? So exciting.
Hi, Sahar. I'm good, actually. I've been really looking forward to this all week.
And of course, our lovely guest, Jarvis Yu. Jarvis, tell people who you are, where people can find you, who are you, and why you're here, basically.
Yeah, I guess people would refer to me as a paper boomer. In the before times, there was a long stretch of time where I played basically every professional level event. I have played 22 Pro Tour slash Pro Tour equivalent events in a row. All by the time I started playing, all of the Pro Tours were basically hybrid, aka they were all draft and constructed by that point, except for the Team Pro Tour, which is obviously is a very special one, where I did in fact play Legacy for my team. Well, we won't talk about that one. That didn't go so well, but sometimes that happens. In general, by day I'm a mathematical statistician, so I feel like I do understand the mathematics behind Magic more than most people, and have a keener eye for identifying problems when they come up. I also stream Magic on Twitch. I post some YouTube VODs, and people can find me for coaching, whether it be any format. Basically, I think I can learn basically anything about Magic, even if I don't know it at the time point, for anyone, pretty much.
And this is why Jarvis is genuinely considered a goat. We love Jarvis. I've certainly followed Jarvis since I started playing Magic, just from the work you've done in other formats, but also particularly with Legacy in terms of the work you did with lands and then multiple other stuff. And then I see you play decks that I don't normally see you play. And then you're like, it works, it's fine, you can play anything you want. It's super cool. But we've got a few. So today's episode is we're going to look at sort of mana bases and deck building and try to understand effectively, if you're a new player or a returning player or you're trying something different, how do you start to approach the idea of deck building and mana bases? Because I feel like it's an art form. There is some maths behind it. You probably should be playing more sources of mana. It's certainly for me, I should be playing a lot more sources of mana. But I think there's some cool tips and tricks that we can get into and sort of get the sort of ball rolling. So I think the first question, certainly for the Legacy format, is for you, Jarvis, and then obviously Sarah, feel free to kind of add some points as well, is what is enough mana sources? I know this is a loaded question to start the discussion of, but what is enough mana sources, Jarvis?
Okay, so yeah, this is kind of a point of contentious debate, I would say. The answer, actually, I would say, depends on your tolerance for mulliganing, is the actual whale dodge jumping on the bomb directly. So some people are willing to mulligan hands that, are willing to mulligan more often and stretch their mana base. That's a fine way to play Magic. I normally don't like to play, so I tend to be on the conservative side. And, there's some checks you can do, even for like monocolor decks, to see, okay, how likely is it I'm going to have to mulligan because I don't even have my single colored source of mana in a monocolor deck. There was a joke up for a long time that Merfolk was the monocolor deck that had the worst mana base because it had like 13 islands and it had like 20 plus blue cards in it because all of the lords are blue. So that was the canonical example, and I'm just like, why does this deck not play enough blue sources? Obviously, Aether Vial used to cheat out some percentage of that. So really, the way you want to answer that question is, what is your tolerance for mulliganing? What is the likelihood that you can keep a hand? For me, I want it to be north of 80% if possible. And obviously, you can never get to 100% because the only way you can get 100% is to have your deck literally all be lands. Then, and it has to be all colored mana sources. It can't be like, 4 Wastelands, 4 Mazavith, 4, Urza Saga, because that doesn't work. Because then, okay, I've drawn a random 7 from my deck. It's just 7 colorless lands that don't produce the color I need. So, great question, but the answer is not a strict mathematical answer. It's your tolerance. And different people have different tolerances.
Yeah, so to kind of lean into that, do you obviously different archetypes have different tolerances as well? So would you be willing to go like below 80% for like an A plus B combo deck, for instance, something like Sneak and Show? Or do you want to be really above 80% for archetypes that really can't leverage that kind of thing and really need card quantity? I'm thinking of any kind of like synergy based deck, something like 8-cast, for instance.
Great question. I think generally when I look at Sneak and Show deck lists, their mana bases tend to be pretty conservative because JPA, I think, Jonathan Angelescu thinks a similar way to I do, but also because since your deck is so fast, you don't actually have a lot of time to spend time dirtling forever. And in fact, I think the slower your deck is, you can use your cantrips as mana fixing. You know, the joke is okay, preordain or ponder or brainstorm is some percentage of the land some amount of the time. Uh, the slower your deck is, and the longer you want to stretch the game out, the more likely it is that your mana will fix itself. Uh, so you can see this in basically all of the four color control decks in Legacy play one life from the loam, a bunch of fetch lands. Because if you ever loam back 3 fetch lands, your mana's set forever. Basically, you're not going to have any issues, barring something like a Blood Moon or a Magus of the Moon, or really your mana being attacked. So, great question. For 8-cast, I think their mana tends to be pretty reasonable as well. Also, Mox Opal, that's some percentage of a boost source. And they're also a monocolor deck that, it's kind of hard to cut them off because they also just play a lot of draw twos. There's also a joke in Booster Draft that, card drawing is mana fixing to some degree because you just see more cards in your deck.
Definitely. I've definitely been that person who I'm like, oh, it's fine. I got a card draw spell. Shape. Well, this is the about sort of the heuristics that people used to apply. I kind of the Turbo Xerox sort of cantrips are land. I noticed with the unbanning of preordained in modern. I think we saw a 15 land Death Shadow deck, and I was like, what? What? But I spoke to Sarah about it. Sarah was like, "This makes perfect sense. Why doesn't it make? But you have cantrips, you can find your lands." And then the old, obviously a friend of yours and well-known pro, Reed Duke, take a Modo list, add extra land, deck's perfect. I was like, these are the heuristics that I think for players who have been in the game for a while, like these are kind of things that have been sort of, I say passed down is the wrong phrase, but kind of, have kind of like come into the zeitgeist of player base of like, okay, well, you can just add land here, or you can take lands away here because you have, this exchanges for this. Well, MDFCs count as like land, and then this had land, and then you can move stuff about. So I kind of, for you now, what are what are sort of the typical heuristics that you still apply, or has Legacy now come to a position where those heuristics aren't as sort of concrete as it was because the format is changing so rapidly and new cards are kind of churning the format every like few months, as it were?
Well, I think it's difficult for the new cards to fundamentally change how the mana system works, barring some cards they really shouldn't print. Like, obviously, they printed like 5 more Moxen that are equivalent to Mox Time, and the format would probably be unplayable, is how I would put it kindly.
Oh.
But, great example are the land cyclers from Lord of the Rings Middle Earth. Generally, I would count those as sort of a tapped land because you do have to invest a mana in using them. And I would say that I've dabbled with Lorien Revealed in the like low to the ground sort of Delvery decks. I think it's actually worse there than it is in a control deck because of what I was referring to earlier. Basically, there's a real cost to using your mana as mana fixing. In a sort of Delver shell, that's not actually what you want to do. The exception is trolls can be reanimated, which that actually does make up the tempo loss that you suffer. But all of the other ones, like Lorien Revealed, it's actually better in something like a 4-color control deck. You can also go find your Mystic Sanctuary, which you want to remain in your deck at all costs. but at some point later in the game, it's great to do it. And also you can sanctuary back the Lorien Reveal. It's kind of a mini combo there, so to speak.
Oh,
Great point about the 15 land stuff in Modern. This is also why you saw Living End cut so low in lands. I actually played Living End right after the set came out, and I'm like, wow, this deck is really powerful. And I went down to 14 lands and played the 8 full red and green land cyclers. I think that build didn't quite stick among other people who played a lot of Living End, but it's just an example of how powerful, the considerations for rebuilding your deck are.
yeah.
Because Living End is structured in such a way that you can just afford to spend time doing nothing on turns 1 and 2. That's how the deck literally operates. And then, you put a bunch of 5/7s and 6/4s into play that it didn't have access to before, and your opponent's just like dead in one shot. So, great point. I would say other considerations are, cards like Lotus Petal and Mox Time and Mox Ripple. They all have slightly different considerations. It also depends a lot on how far up the curve your deck wants to go, I would say. So something like 4-color control, it's going to want to go to like 5-6 mana basically every game, to cast a 4th Arrowingus in the end game to finish your opponent off, and then, return it and cast it again for a large number, as a pseudo fireball. But basically I would say the lower your curve is, the less lands you need. And to use an example from Booster Draft again, the reason most decks in Booster Draft play 17 lands are not because it actually needs that many actual lands in play. It's because in a 2-color deck, a 9/8 mana base is actually not a very good mana base. You suffer a lot of problems even with a 9/8 mana base. So when you get the opportunity to draft a monocolor deck in Draft, that's why you often see the professionals go down to like 15 or 14 lands, because you'll actually have enough lands on average, but there's no issue with your colors.
Yeah.
So you can see this in Vintage Cube sometimes. People will, if you end up in mono white or mono red, they'll have like a 14, 15 mana, deck, especially if their curve is low. You saw this in original Mirrodin because of the mirror. Basically, there were a lot of 14 to 16 land decks. Zendikar Rising, also a similar thing, although there I would say the computation was more reliant on how good the MDFCs were to cast on the backside. If they were good to cast on the backside, then you actually wanted to treat them as spells with the option of buying them out as a land in games where you're screwed, which is obviously a nice option to have. So, a lot to think about. I used a bunch of examples that maybe people weren't so familiar with, given that Magic's been around forever, but it is a great question.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of drill into something that you brought up. So we talking about different cards as some percentage of a land.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any kind of like common figures that you tend to use? Like the old
Mm-hmm.
one was obviously like a cantrip is around half a land in kind of the traditional Turbo Xerox idea. Do you think that still applies, or do you use slightly different numbers? What is a tap land? Like, is a tap land a land, or is it like 0.8 of a land because of the tempo loss? How do you usually think of those things?
Yeah, great question. I'm a notorious hater of Castle Octane in basically all formats, including Pioneer. I've beaten the drum on this that I basically think it's unplayable, which famous streamer Misplaced Ginger plays basically 2 to 3 Castle Octane all the time. I'm just like, it doesn't work. So basically, the way to view it for all of those questions is, I think the 1/2 of land is kind of a misquoted figure. I think the percentage of lands it represents is closer to the percentage of lands that are in your deck. So what I mean is something like, I guess the simplest example is Reach Through Mist, which is a single blue arcane spell from Champions of Kamigawa. Literally says draw a card. So if you have 17 lands left in your 53 card deck, I would say that represents basically a third of land on average. Something like Ponder or Preordain, since it sees more cards, is going to represent more lands on average than that because it just sees more cards. And also, if you see 2 lands, you can just leave them both on top. It works out a lot better. So it quickly becomes convoluted, and there's not a great rule of thumb. But I would say the easiest rule of thumb is a cantrip can represent basically the proportion of lands that are in your deck. to quote actual Alan Cummer's original in Turbo Xerox, there were 17 islands in his mono blue deck out of 60. So I would say the single mana, he played Portent back then, I believe, which is ponder but slow, but it does do the trick if you cast on turn 1. It's like on turn 1, ponder and Portent are exactly the same mono-severe combo deck. So I would say in his deck, it would actually represent 17 out of 60 of a land, which is close, lower than a third. It's actually slightly above a fourth, you know?
About 30%, I think.
Yeah. So basically, I think that heuristic is kind of old and outdated. It should actually be closer to the percentage of cards you see times the it's basically the number of cards you see times the proportion of lands in your deck, or the percentage of lands in your deck, is how I would treat it.
Okay. And are you counting ponder as saying 3 cards or 4 cards for that calculation?
3 cards, because the shuffle basically resets everything.
Yeah.
Is how I would put it. It it people say it sees 4 cards, but the fourth card you see is random. So that's why I don't think it's a great way to put that. In terms of let's see, what was the other question you had about besides the cantrips?
It was kind of like, do you count tap lands as full land?
Okay,
That kind of thing. So, like, is
so
Troll of Khazad-dûm a land, or is it?
so that one's a little more convoluted. I think like there's a difference between trolls and like Twitter West. Both of cards which see a heavy amount of play. Twitter West exists in Amulet Titan basically as a broken tutor, because a land that tutors up Summoner's Pact or Engineer Explosives or Urza Saga is kind of a broken land. That one in that deck I would obviously count as a land. Trolls, I think, because you need an initial starting mana source, it can be more convoluted to figure out what percentage of a land it should be. I would say, since you're like willing to keep a hand that has one land and troll often in like the Death Shadows decks in Legacy, however many lands are in that deck, like actual lands, say 18, I think that's probably close to correct or reasonably around there. I would say trolls represents like 18 out of 60 of a land. So a lot of the time, you notice I don't have a set figure, but it really depends on the proportion of lands in the deck already, or how the deck is constructed. Mostly because I think assigning a static figure to a deck, or to a card like that, without any consideration for what the rest of the cards in the deck are, is just not correct. It should be reliant on how the deck is already constructed.
Yeah, so like taking the proportions in as a way of
Yes.
making the context actually mathematical,
Right.
in what you're doing, which is really helpful. Like, I haven't seen people approach it in that way very often. I have seen it before, but it's not the most common way of doing it, right?
Right. I think really you would more likely see that when you're talking to statisticians, because they understand the context of a deck. It's not just a static thing. It ebbs and flows. This is like basically building different machine learning models or whatever. The context matters of what you're trying to model. So you really need to keep in account what you're actually trying to do, what's already in the deck.
Yeah.
I'm just imagining that all the decks are just like different models that are running on computers, and just
Right.
like it's just like everything's playing at each other, and just like the whole smorgasbord is like, here's a deck, here's another deck, here's how it all plays out, here's how it finishes, and eventually.
So, like, obviously we have a focus on this channel of being like people's introduction to Legacy, giving them resources on how to learn how to be better at Legacy. So one of the things we recommend a ton is for people to net deck their first couple decks, because you're coming in, you don't really have context on construction. Go trust someone who's already winning with the thing, right? So if you went to NetDeck, say you were trying to learn a new archetype, I remember you doing a really good Twitter thread on Scam recently, which was really helpful for our episode. Do you do any kind of checking on the mana base when you're net decking? Like, what kind of things do you look at to think, do I have to change this mana base, when you're initially approaching a new format or a new deck?
Great question. there's a bunch of things I do. First thing, if it's an older format, say, Modern Plus, where fetch lands are legal, I check to make sure the fetch lands actually make sense with how the lands are set up. There was a famous Grand Prix where someone top 8 with Grixis Death Shadow, but they had Flooded Strands in their deck, and I just looked at the deck, I'm like, this doesn't fetch Blood Crypt. And the person came out on Twitter and said, yeah, I accidentally misregistered my deck. I had Flooded Strands in when they weren't supposed to be in, but they still did well. But you could tell who just copied that deck without thinking, because there were still Flooded Strands with the Blood Crypts in the deck. And that's clearly a mistake. So it's very funny.
Oh my god.
So that's the first thing I do. I just do a quick spot check, and if everything looks correct, like the vegetables make sense, then what I'll do sometimes is just load the deck into Cockatrice, generate a bunch of sample hands. I'm like, how would I fetch with this hand? Is this hand even keepable? What's the plan for the first few turns? And how am I forced to fetch? I'll just do 20 or so hands of that. And then after all of that, if I think the deck sort of makes sense, then I'll actually do the real mathematical spot check using a site that I've stumbled upon called mtgoncurve.com. I think it's some programmer who just wanted to write a better checker out there, because it uses Monte Carlo simulation to check how likely it is to cast spells on curve. It does make a bunch of assumptions that are not great, but the problem is it's very easy to get convoluted logic for hands that you can't really cover. Like, it doesn't really cover the MDFCs very well. It obviously can't really code logic for trolls or whatever. So I think we'll do a quick demo after the cast, and I'll show you all how it works. But it is a very useful tool, especially if you don't have weird, Mox Opal, Lotus Petal sort of things involved.
Yeah, but even in those cases, right, it gives you the lower bound, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Because everything you're saying would make it better than the figure it would give you, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And one quick note about that site is, once a new set comes out, the person has to update the database that it runs on. So for a while, in the initial stages of a new set coming out, I'll just use older cards at the exact same mana cost to proxy the new cards in terms of logic checking.
Yeah.
Obviously, it doesn't really matter. It's exactly the same from the computer standpoint, but it's just the new cards are not in the database, so it doesn't know what they cost.
Here's basically a quick example. Again, it makes some assumptions. It doesn't count Simian Spirit Guide or Chrome Mox's mana sources, because it's kind of hard logic to program that in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But if you ignore that stuff, it tells you how likely you can cast stuff by the turn you're trying to cast it, according to its own logic. So the problem is, obviously, it treats Blood Moon and Fable as 3-drops.
Yeah.
They're closer to 1-drop, so this is not the best use of it. I would say for Moonstompy and specifically, this is probably not great, because there's too much wrong with it.
Well, let's look at let's take another deck then, so we can do this live.
Sure. A better example is probably the Boros Burn deck that I played and you played.
Yes.
If you still have that.
I do. Somewhere in the annals of this internet, I still have some. All right, let me find the burn deck. Return of the burn. I got it. Return of the burn. All right, I'm gonna do this with burn. Return of the burn. Okay. All right, let's do this with burn. Okay. Right. Oh my god, I love it.
Basically, there's a few numbers to look at.
Yep.
Probability of mana per turn, given turn. That's not generally the one I want to look at, because it assumes...
Okay.
What's the best way of putting it? Yeah, that's not quite correct. Probability of mana, I think, is the better thing to look at.
Yep.
Yeah, and you're basically close to 100% to have it, as you can tell. Makes sense. This is a 2-color deck. All of your things fixed for the right mana. If you look in the mana base, it shows you what things tap for what mana.
Yeah.
It assumes that fetch lands are rainbow lands, which is a reasonable assumption a lot of the time.
Yeah, makes sense.
I don't think there's a few other things you can do with it. You can also have it mulligan more or less aggressively depending on your parameters.
Let's say mull to 6, like as a this is mulligan to 5. So you're mulligan to 6. Like mulligan to 6. Your probabilities just go up. You're just like, oh, just a mulligan. Actually, this is the point. Let's actually go, because one of the things is like I want to see if it goes to 4. I mean, even
the lower you're going to mulligan, the more likely you are to have the mana on the correct turn.
Yeah, because
basically aggressive mulliganing means you're more likely to have the colors you need. But if you want to say, okay, I really hate mulliganing to 5.
Yeah.
I want to mulligan to 6 if possible, and I want to see if my parameters work out. This is a good way to check.
Yep.
Obviously, like that's why you can see when you mulligan to 6, sometimes you won't be able to cast Rift Bolt on turn 3, or but that's where it's like actual casting costs, not for. So it's just a good way to spot check.
I'm just gonna check I'm gonna use another. I've got my current build of Delver. I'm just going to try a couple of examples. So, my current build of Delver, let's use that as a thing. So, does sideboarding then just? It doesn't work with sideboarding. I take it. It just makes the numbers all.
The way you want to approach sideboarding is just manually edit. The file.
Matches. Yeah. So exactly. So this is Delver as it stands. So you're obviously you're. I love how it's Murktide Regent on 7. Okay, Then the last 2 are obviously like a bit warped because these aren't actually things like that. But this is kind of. What does it mean by 1+1? What does that mean?
I would ignore that. I mean, obviously, it knows that you can always cast it.
Yeah, that's
really
fair.
So.
And then. I mean, these numbers are very good.
Basically, probability of play. It means that. For that number, with respect to Mishra's Bubble, that's actually how likely it is to be in your opening hand. That's literally what it means there.
So the P play is it being in your opening 7.
Well, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's fine.
You can tell for Brainstorm, it actually takes into account the probability of mana multiplied by the probability that you're able to cast it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Basically, it's in your hand and you're able to cast it is the P play.
That makes sense. Oh, the one that Murktide Region's so low. Okay, so things like it's obviously like your cantrips are obviously going to be quite high, and your creatures are kind of like the things like that. I'm just going to take one more quick deck that not going to defies the logic, but just sort of for legacy at least is sort of look at it. So let's take the sort of the boogeyman of the format, which is Death Shadow, because Death Shadow, similar to Delver, I don't know if it breaks it, like if it breaks it completely, but I think it is maybe it's I'm just trying to find a list that actually works. I think I found one. So with Death Shadow, I think maybe again because of the way that the deck is constructed. I can't find Troll. Okay, so that's understandable. So Judge, not gonna cut it. Okay, so it's not running Troll. Okay, maybe that's not the best example. All right, well, I mean, just is there a card that's similar to Troll? No.
So look at the date it updated. I think it might not be updated
July the 1st, so it's July 1st, so I don't think
so just put in Twisted Abomination.
So 3 Twisted Abomination. There you go.
It's an obscure card from Scourge. It has Swamp Cycling 2.
Yeah.
And it's a much worse card.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just remember obscure cards.
Yeah.
So, again, that number doesn't mean that much because that's not what the card's actually designed to do. So,
but the rest of it is fine. Still like, no wonder Bowmasters is, so good. Like, I'm just looking at these numbers and you go, okay, like these are all things like that. But yeah, no, that's super interesting. I think it's an interesting. It's another way of looking at it, and it's like obviously running, the numbers and like using these calculating the probability. I think this is a tool to use alongside the knowledge base and knowledge base you're developing, rather than it being like the sort of
Yeah.
the stats, like in poker, or poker, you're like, well, the stats tell me X. It's like, well, no, the stats tell you the stats will tell you this much of the story, and the rest is sometimes magic just happens at you. But even in this, in the results that this has done, this is kind of how it should play out. You can tell a programmer kind of got slightly bored and was like, I just want to, I know researchers who would just do this as like, oh yeah, we'll fix this is fine. And I like, there is a growing, I say growing, there's more than one and less than four sort of magic players and researchers who are either working in AI and working in machine learning, myself working in games research myself, and it's just like, I'm not surprised this exists. I'm not surprised someone has gone into GitHub and is like, here's all the code I've ever done to try and figure out how to make magic consistent. And also Frank Carsten, big up to Frank Carsten for all the work that Frank does. Like, I think I said to someone initially, like, Jarvis has one way of looking at it, Frank has another way of looking at it, but together they basically are just like some, put those knowledge bases together. You are literally like it's like every deck's perfect. Literally, it all makes sense. It all works out mathematically. We're good. So read Frank Carsten's articles, read Jarvis's articles on Manabases and stuff like that, because I think it's, for me, as someone who kind of, I'm of the school of thought which is like vibes only. And that is good to a point, but sometimes you just need some like actual stats behind what you're doing. So on that, actually, it's interesting how I think Moxfield, obviously you've got MTGOnCurve, but also I think like I think it's interesting you do the cockatrice hand checks and stuff. I know Moxfield, you can do hand checks quite a lot as well. I think those websites definitely help you with that. I find the one of the challenges from more deck building side rather than Manabases is that with like Goldfish, I like that it breaks down like what percentage of cards are in there, but I find that only gives you information to a point of like, oh, okay, so they play it this much of the time, but that you lose the context of why those cards are in. So I know that there's been times where people go, well, why isn't this card played? And it's like, well, if someone's coming, the example is always like, someone comes from another format, like, why isn't this card played all the time? Like, because the format isn't lent that way to do it. Like someone, like I saw a tweet that was like, oh, the red black scam deck is like a legacy power level deck. I'm like, yes, and also no, because the scam part of it, yes, but the rest of it, no, that is not legacy power level stuff for you to do. And it's interesting when you look at across formats how deck-based mana bases and deck construction is built. Because obviously you look at modern, me and Sarah, when we were preparing for the episode, I was like, the amount of triomes and the fact that you can get colors so easily and rapidly without any issues. In Legacy, that's like, I'm going to say kind of unheard of. Like you lose so much tempo by committing to colors, which is why like I look at the 4-color mana bases, I'm like, I appreciate you want to go to like turn 8 or 10, but your mana's so convoluted that it's like, why just maybe shave a color. Have you considered maybe shaving a color? No. Okay, cool. But it seems to work, so I trust the control pilots to know what they're doing in terms of how they kind of do that moving forward.
Just to actually kind of like drill in to like the differences between formats a little bit. Obviously, one of the big differences between Modern and Legacy is that we have access to mana denial in Legacy in a way that isn't really present in Modern. How do you factor that in to kind of like your mana base construction? Are you more likely to play more basics? Do you have to play more lands because of the presence of mana denial? Like, I know this is going to be super context dependent, but say if you were like, just to like compare and contrast, you're building some sort of like mid-range deck in Modern, and you're building some sort of mid-range strategy in Legacy. Like, how would your approaches to constructing those mana bases differ?
Great question. Okay, so I'll tackle the Modern question first because I think it's a little bit easier to parse. The major concerns in Modern for me when I'm playing, say, 4C Omnath, which I've played a fair amount, A, Blood Moon from, say, Rakdos Scam, B, getting Boseju'd out from a different deck, and see sometimes fringe, Ghost Quarter from like a mono white Leonin Arbiter deck, but those decks have basically been hunted to extinction because of Fury and Solitude. So those are my primary concerns. Sometimes Tide Shaper or Spreading Seas is a concern, but really the way you power through that is to just fetch more dual lands instead of less. So in basically Modern, I try to have one of each basic land, if at all possible, in my decks. You will note that Rakdos Scam doesn't play Basic Mountain, and a lot of decks that play Red don't play Basic Mountain because that doesn't make sense to counteract Blood Moon.
Yep,
That's the opposite of what you want to do. So usually the Rakdos Scam deck plays 3 to 4 swamps, a bunch of dual lands. That's how it tackles that. For me, in the 4-color Omnath deck, I'll play Forest Island Plains and a bunch of Triomes and a bunch of fetches and just assume everything works out because of Ren 6. I used to play Abundant Growth, but that card has been power crept out mostly because you have to spend mana either killing the scam threats. You don't really have time to play Abundant Growth to get around, a Blood Moon. The One Ring also means that a small ball card draw spell is not as good. So all of these considerations came into mind. Abundant Growth is a fantastic tool sometimes, but now it's been sort of obsoleted, which is kind of funny because I think when it was originally printed in Avacyn Restored, people didn't really think anything of the card. It's just such an innocuous looking card. It doesn't really, do anything. With regards to Legacy, the interesting part of it is I think there are two approaches you can take with regards to mana denial. You can either play all dual lands and just pretend that you're going to plow through wastelands by fetching duals repeatedly, and eventually, like in the 4C decks, again, this is stapled together via Life from the Loam, so you can sort of overpower wastelands as long as there's not an unlimited number of them. Or you can try to play basics, but I would say the problem for most decks trying to play basics in the format is basics don't cast a lot of spells in your multicolor decks.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is you open a hand that of Source of Plowshares, Uro, Prismatic Ending. The more color intensive your deck is, the worse it is to have basics in it, barring something like Arkham's Astrolabe. That's why Alabe was really, really powerful.
Oh my god.
It sort of invalidated
busted.
It invalidated Wasteland, it invalidated Blood Moon, it invalidated the fact that you could just fetch a bunch of basics, play 2 Astrolabes, and you could cast all of the spells in your deck regardless what was going on. Now you don't really have that option anymore. So I would say there are really two approaches if you're playing a normal deck, which is either play all dual lands or play 3 basics and try to cut down the color requirements of your cards. Basically, if you see someone play Hymn to Tarok in their blue midrange deck, it's almost a lock that they have no basic lands because it just doesn't work. I learned this lesson basically the hard way playing Shardless Sultai back in the before times. It was probably 2013 by this point where I used to play basics. Then I noticed that the basics were just harming me more than not. And this was even with Deathrite Shaman in my deck. So I eventually just cut all of the basics and just only played dual lands. And I played, it usually worked itself out.
Yeah.
I want to note that you said during that explanation when you're playing a normal deck.
Mm-hmm.
So just want to kind of like drill into what's abnormal under that kind of thing. Are we counting Stompy because, they tend to leverage soul lands as something abnormal there? Are we counting like the control decks? Because I know some of the control decks play Prismatic Vista, so they play a very high amount of basics, which is another way of like are combo decks abnormal because they use a lot of mana acceleration? Kind of like, how do you define what's normal versus not normal in this context?
I guess I was using normal in this context to refer to the fact that you're playing like a, removal and creatures sort of game. So control or mid-range or even like Delver or those sorts of decks fall into that category. Abnormal to me in this category would be something that does something kind of weird off the beaten path. Oops All Spells is a great example of this because that deck is extremely abnormal in terms of its mana construction and how the games play out, obviously. Like no game lasts past like turn 3 pretty much, except like maybe a post board game. Something like Goblin Charbelcher in Modern also falls under that. Lotus Field. There was actually a very clever riff on the Charbelcher deck that Matt Nass played in Modern, which was Lotus Field, but it only had the one land in the deck was Lotus Field, so Abundant Harvest always hit it. So basically, Abundant Harvest became a one-mana tutor for Lotus Field, but obviously this was only possible because of Zendikar Rising. Otherwise, the deck doesn't work as well. So those are great examples of abnormal decks. Probably the Stompy deck I would also describe in that sort of area, because the way you construct your mana bases, you basically have a bunch of mountains, Chrome Mox, Lotus Petal, Shatter Skull Smashing, sometimes some creature lands and Den of the Bugbear. 8 casts also falls in that sort of area. Storm obviously does, because the games don't last that long and a bunch of your mana is ritual or artifact based. So definitely agree with you. Normal to me meant like creatures and removal, and just playing, run your creatures into each other, kill their stuff, and whoever comes out on top comes out on top.
Your blue decks, Maverick, Death and Taxes, anything that isn't trying to cheat on the fundamental of lands, creatures, and spells. That to me is how I've looked at it, which is strange, because I'm gonna throw a slight curveball. Where does lands fit into it? Because that lands, it kind of that deck for me like defies just it just like takes all the rules and is like, nope, just we have our own rule book over here from like an outsider looking. I know obviously you're a lands connoisseur, looking at that beautiful Mox Diamond behind you, but like, does lands just also like defy the all the stuff that we've just said as well for Legacy?
Oh, actually, I think the opposite is true.
Okay.
A lot of the lands mana bases, in my opinion, are stretched very heavily for basically no gain.
That's fair.
You have to follow the Karsten rules there for your turn 1 exploration, because casting exploration later is really not as good a lot of the time.
That's fair.
Again, it comes back to the tolerance for mulliganing. Yeah. I know Ali really, really is okay mulliganing a lot more hands than I am. I tend to build very conservative mana bases with a lot of green sources. I basically, do follow the Karsten articles to a T here almost. So that's why I try to get as many turn 1 green sources in as possible. This is also exacerbated by the fact that if you want to play something like Elvish Reclaimer in a post-board game, you do also need turn 1 green sources for that, because its power scales longer it's in play. I remember playing really, really bad lands mana bases back when the deck was called 43. It was literally just called 43 because that described how many lands were in it. It used to have to play Terraria West, Creeping Tar Pit, Mishra's Factory. Sometimes I played Nantucket Monastery. You don't see any of these cards anymore because the threats in the land slots have gotten so much better. Like Urza Saga obviously is a game changer with Thespian Stage. I call it the pack rat land, because it eventually it starts churning out pack rats. You don't have to do hard work to kill your opponent if you really want to anymore. Obviously, Dark Depths. Dark Depths existed forever. It was in Cold Snap. It's just in Gate Crash when Thespian Stage came out. Really, things changed a lot because the legend rule also used to be different. It used to be that if you had 2 legends in play, they would both get annihilated, like antimatter style. And even before that, the legend rule way back when was even more unpleasant. Whoever played the first legend just locked the opponent out of playing any legends named that. Basically, this became unbearable when Lin Civi was a dominant deck in Standard, the Rebels Mirror. So if you were the first to Lin Civi, your opponent had to have like a removal spell for the Lin Civi, then cast their own, then you would have to remove theirs. The Rebel chains were just too powerful.
Gee, that is like, I've looked back at like Magic history and like standard decks of way back when. Holy, like the rules were just the rules were wild. What happened? But yeah, it's interesting you talk about like with the land, the sort of lands kind of developing, and obviously I think as you said, Urza Saga is like the best thing you could be doing. I'm now just going to call it pack rat. Be like, look, we just make more constructs. See, we make more constructs, we attack you, we kill you, and you're dead. Please just attack, turn men sideways. So on that point, in terms of like Urza Saga and the things like, how do you count? I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but things like temporary mana sources or mana sources, of course. We also talked about the cyclers before, but things like Simian Spirit Guide, Mox Diamond, all these stuff that is like either a one-shot mana source or you have to kind of work for it effectively. So, invest mana to make mana, stuff like that. Like, is that something that players should be leaning on more depending on the decks they're playing, or is it something that it's dependent on the deck that they're playing? Like Simian Spirit Guide and like Moon Stompy is like the best thing since Sliced Bread, because it's like, you're telling me I can accelerate even further? Oh, very nice, thank you very much. But I don't know how in a sort of typical deck, I use this as an example because I know that for a little while there was like Death and Taxes and even Control were trying things like Chrome Mox and Lotus Petal to get ahead on curve, but that sort of counteracts what those decks are trying to do. So kind of wanted to get your take on sort of temporary mana sources, for want of a better phrase, or mana sources that you have to put something into it.
Great question. With regards to, I guess, Mox Diamond right here, that one's easier. I generally, in decks that have enough lands, I just would count it as a permanent mana source. If it's in your opening hand, obviously, Mox Diamond used to be really safe. It used to never die, but Prismatic Ending obviously changed that a little bit. So It's a little bit unsafe to count it as a permanent colored source nowadays, but I think if you're not playing against a control deck, it's generally safe to count it as a permanent mana source. And sometimes you see people side out Mox Diamond versus control for that reason. I think that's like the opposite of what you want to do, but people will try things out. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Also, Mox Diamond pumps all of your constructs, so kind of weird to side it out when it's doing that as well. So I think Mox Diamond's a simple one. Just, it's fine. It's a mana source a large portion of the time. Probably, if it's not a mana source in your opening hand, you probably should just not keep that hand, because like if you have only a one land hand, unless if there's something very weird going on, I know in pre-modern they just banned land tax, but a very common play was just Mox Diamond land tax go, and your opponent was just in the squeeze. They couldn't really play a land in that because then you would just draw 3 lands, and you just would intentionally skip your land drop because it put them in such a bad spot. Sam Black basically broke the format, and no one's allowed to play with land tax anymore in that format. So
I love how with pre-modern it's sort of been sort of it's a sort of sort of community format, and everyone's been playing it, and then Sam Black just rocks up one day and it's just and it's just like, okay, everyone, land tax busted. Did you know land tax? I knew land tax. I played Terrageddon, so I was like, land tax, best thing to be doing. Here's Armageddon. Here's that huge friend. Attack you for like 20 or something. But yeah, I did enjoy that. Just Sam Black just takes a sniff of an interest on the format. A few of the pros take an interest on this format, and then just break it. I'm like, oh, there's no innovation left? I think not. Cool. So yeah, you spoke about Mox Diamond. What about things like Lotus Petal and Simian Spirit Guide then, Jarvis? Sort of what I call one-shot mana sources in that respect. And then we can obviously expand onto things like rituals, but I think kind of the one-shot sort of mana in that respect. How do you sort of look at that in terms of temporary sources?
Yeah, again, I think the context matters a little bit here. Obviously, I'll be saying that a lot, I guess, just in general. You actually did see some decks during the mono white initiative era in Legacy. They played Lotus Petal to try to speed up and tried to be on the same, relevant time frame, because initiative really compressed the games into such a short time frame. In those sort of fair decks, Lotus Petal I would not count it as a permanent mana source, but what it was designed to do was let you be at the same sort of speed level and compete. I would say, a more canonical example is Simian Spirit Guide in Moonstompy. It's obvious that you have to play it in the deck, I think, because your deck is designed to play a 3-drop on turn 1. So you need to just maximize the probability of a 3-drop on turn 1. So you need to play all of the Spirit Guides, Chrome Mox and Lotus Petals that your hands can get on. I've also sometimes thought that maybe that deck should play 1 Gemstone Caverns as a 5th, Chrome Mox or whatever. Obviously, like, too much card disadvantage in one game is not going to be great for you, but in general, I would say Spirit Guide and Petal, I don't really count as mana sources because they do, disappear. Yeah. So, obviously, in terms of being a colored mana source for Moonstompy, especially with Chrome Mox involved, I think it's okay to count it in that regard, but as like an actual mana source, probably not. And the other issue is like counting Lotus Petal as a mana source and say, Storm when your actual lands are under attack by Wasteland sometimes can be dangerous as well, even though it is an integral part of your deck. So I would say if you're not sure how to handle it, just don't count them as permanent mana sources and it'll probably work out better for you. Obviously, like if you understand exactly what you're doing, you can count it as whatever percentage of a mana source you want to. I would say if you're in that sort of area, you could probably say like a third, but that's just a rule of thumb. That's not based on anything except, experience and building a lot of decks.
Oh, I need to stop counting Simian Spirit God as a mana source.
Yes,
I have definitely put it in my numbers.
We're kind of getting into that kind of like conservative approach again, where I feel like this keeps coming up, where it's like you need mana to play your games. So if you're not sure what you're doing, err on the conservative side. Tends to be kind of thing. Because, if you can't play your spells, you're not playing Magic. Whereas if you have slightly too much mana, you're still going to play Magic, right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely, around the Initiative era and also post-ban of White Primitive, rest in peace, I definitely have seen Stompy pilots try to use the Initiative mechanic and try to, quickly get a threat out. We saw that with Red Green having 8 Spirit Guides as a sort of mana source and stuff like that, and people trying to play multicolored Stompy decks. And I think I've spoken about this, but I think XJHL John Ryan Hamilton spoke about is that it's just creaks. You just get to a point where, because you're trying to put so much good spells, if you can't cast it, your mana, I use this phrase, the mana base creaks every time you play Stompy deck that is more than one color, because colorless is a color. Heaven forbid, folks, colorless is a color. So I always just go like, I look at the red-white decks, I'm like, you want to cast red and white? No, that doesn't. You want Fury and Solitude? No, that doesn't like, my brain just doesn't compute that, because I think it breaks a lot of the fundamentals of like deck construction when you're trying to make that work in a land base that doesn't allow you to get ahead on mana. And then you have the issues where it I think I said a lot, a wasteland can kind of stop your deck doing anything, and you're just there like and then you just cry.
I think what you said there, Sahar, is kind of like the received wisdom of how to think about Stompy, where you consider colorless as a color. So when you think of like red Stompy, you would think of its mana base as a 2-color mana base.
Yes, 100%.
Because of how it's constructed, you are brought in to have to play the soul lands, which only make colorless. So you consider that as,
a color in its own right, yeah.
But, we're also asking questions about these kind of received wisdom things. Like we talked about Turbo Xerox, we talked about Three Dukes, Add a Land idea. Do you think that heuristic is still up to date, or do you think it's become outdated now, Jarvis?
The Add a Land heuristic, or what heuristic?
No, I just mean like when you're looking at red Stompy, you kind of count it as like a 2-color deck, where colorless is one of the colors.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Great question. It's probably better to think of it that way than a different way, because the soul lands, let you have that powerful draw on turn 1 more often. I guess it's also kind of weird, now that I think about it, that maybe the deck should play Crystal Vein, now that I'm thinking about it. But that's
there we go. Creative technique, is that you?
Well, Crystal Vein is usually associated with nonsense. basically in general. Yeah, great question. I think it's probably closer to the truth to view it as a 2-color deck where soul lands are like one of the colors. But then, like, if you only have 8 sources of that one color, it is kind of weird. So the math gets funny. So, probably the truth is in between, but it is probably closer to correct to view it that way. What, with regards to the Stompy thing, I do agree with you all that the 2-color Stompy decks don't work, but that's I think they just don't play enough colored mana sources because Cavern of Souls doesn't really quite work. The joke I had was when I saw people play gold cards in the deck, and I'm like, oh, perfect. This is the best card to put in a Chrome box because then you can cast all of your spells. Like, the joke was way back when, basically, when I was starting out in extended affinity. Chrome Mox and Printing Fire Ice let you cast all of your spells. And come to your affinity count. People were playing with some really bad cards back then. People were playing like Standstill in their affinity decks, Ninja at the Deep Powers. Like it was a mess. But
I loved that deck. Please don't talk too badly about it.
That deck was so good.
Tempered Steel was my first ever standard deck, and kind of I was addicted to playing artifacts from day one, pretty much.
And it hasn't changed ever since.
No, it really hasn't. I still play way too many artifacts in general. So kind of like moving on from the temporary mana sources, we've talked a bit about kind of like fetches as like a core of the legacy mana base. Kind of a question that I think comes up a lot is kind of like how do you decide on that fetch land versus fetchable split? Kind of how many fetchables is enough? I know it's going to be very contextual, but I have seen people get to the point where their fetch lands can't fetch things anymore. Is that kind of an error in deck construction? Is that just an issue of how the games go? Just in general, like when you're looking at a mana base that has fetches and fetchables, how do you kind of weigh up how much of one versus how many of the other?
Yeah, great question. Of course, there's like a million things to think about here again, as I'm wont to do. The one thing about the fetchable versus fetch count that applies basically only to Legacy is Brainstorm. You basically always want to fetch land with Brainstorm because that makes the card closer to Ancestral Recall than Reach with your Miss. Those cards are wildly different in power level. So I would say, like, if you have Brainstorm in your deck, you really want to play as many fetch lands as possible. With it, like canonically in the Delver Shells, it's difficult to play more than 8 fetch lands because you do need to retain enough actual colored mana sources, especially if you're getting wastelanded. So that's why you generally only see 8. In the slower controlling decks, you'll see more fetch lands, but also they play more lands, period. So you do see that. And there's also the notion that if you have something like Yavimaya or Urborg in your deck, it's actually okay to play more fetch lands than fetchables because at some point your fetch lands will tap for mana by themselves because of that. I've also seen this happen when your opponent has Blood Moon out. You can start tapping them for red, obviously, assuming you can operate under a Blood Moon. Okay. I would say in general, if you're not sure, try to have close to an even split of fetch lands and fetchables because it will tend to balance itself out. The 8/6 thing in Delver is close to balanced, and Brainstorm often fixes that. Also, Daze picks up a land, and you can Brainstorm the land back in. All sorts of weird stuff can happen in that regard. Another consideration is maybe not so much for this format, but Delve cards, also make fetch lands better. Like Murktide Regent, you do want fetch lands for that. Although it is obviously better to double away spells. Having both helps. Just getting out faster. There's a good reason that fetch lands are banned in Pioneer. I think the format would be so warped around fetch lands otherwise. So yeah, great question. Brainstorms in primary consideration. Having a close to balanced split between fetchables and non-fetchables is probably going to work itself out most often. And Delve cards are the other consideration, I would say.
Okay, so to kind of like drill into that, you mentioned mana denial as a main kind of thing that you're factoring in here. And it kind of ties in with what we were going to ask next is like, are we playing enough basic lands in Legacy? And do basic lands affect these splits one way or the other? Because obviously if you can fetch a basic, that is immune to most forms of mana denial. It's obviously not immune to Rashad. But, it's not wastelandable, which is a big part of the game.
Yeah, great question. Again, I kind of think the basic versus non-basic thing, it really depends on what your color requirements look like. Again, if you're playing Hymn to Torok, probably hard to justify playing two main basics, if any. If you're playing basically, like Ice Fang, Coatl, and Uro, although I guess those cards have sort of fallen out of favor because of Bowmasters, it's okay to play more basics to support that stuff. Maybe not Uro so much because it's the backside is blue, blue, green, green, which is kind of restrictive. But Ice Fang, it's okay to play basics. Another thing I would say is if you sideboard Carpet of Flowers, it's definitely okay to sideboard or have basic forest in your deck because Carpet basically fixes everything versus a deck that's trying to wasteland you and daze you, stuff like that. So there's a few considerations. I would say generally speaking, people are usually playing the correct number of basics, one or the other. Sometimes you see zero, but that's because they're trying to like stretch their mana a lot. Sometimes you see a bunch because their deck is a monocolor deck where they can play a bunch of basics. I think the deck that plays the most swamps is like mono black Helm. It plays a lot of swamps and a bunch of soul lands, and it's mostly immune to mana disruption, except obviously a wasteland on Saga matters, but that's more about denying threats rather than denying the mana. So I would say probably most decks have enough basics, and sometimes the correct number is zero.
Yeah, I definitely looking at like old check part, like Thomas Schmar check card decks. I'm like, how do you? No, you can't fit a basic in here. How do you fit a? I just want like it. The idea of like, dude. But the thing is, one thing that actually, and I think Prismatic Vista, Sarah mentioned it before, is Jeskai Control. I have seen Jeskai Control have like you. I've seen it go to like nearly all basic lands because Prismatic Vista fixes a lot of issues, and I think it may run like a tundra, a volcanic island, and that's kind of it. Like I feel like that deck, because it's trying to go long, like can afford to play the amount of basics it does because they know that the game is going to go to my kind of canonic thing is 10,000 years and we're still playing this damn game against Jeskai. But I think that's like the one deck in the format which really does lean on basics heavily as its primary mana, because they have things like Back to Basics, they have Blood Moon, to try and sort of negate some of the sort of the challenges around that. So I think it is interesting, just like how many basics. It's interesting. We actually talked about Astrolabe earlier, and obviously when you're talking about it, Jarvis, I shivered because I think the story for me of when I knew Astrolabe was too broken, I was playing Delver, and my opponent goes basic island, basic plains, basic forest, blood moon with an Astrolabe. I'm like, nope, I'm out. This card's busted. Get out. How have you got a blood moon and there's no red? So I was like, oh, I can't do it. So yeah, if they print another one mana a one mana filter that draws them a card, no thank you. Please. I beg you. Don't give us that.
I think when I think about Jeskai Control in particular, it's not always entirely about the Blood Moon and the Back to Basics in my mind.
I agree.
There's a lot about the fact that they really don't want to stumble on their mana because they want to get to like these key points. Yeah. And so they're traditionally a lot more vulnerable to mana denial. So it makes sense for them to play around it, right?
Yeah.
Like, it makes a lot of sense for them.
They want to get to turn 3 like 90% of the time. Yeah. And they want to have 3 lands in play. They want to be hitting. I mean, all the control decks want to hit their land drops, that's true. But I think in like 4C, because they have like carpet, they'll like utilize that in like the mirrors and stuff. But I think like Jeskai kind of is like, I want to hit every single land drop. I want to hit my cantrips, find me my answers. I want to hit Teferi on turn 3 and all this kind of stuff. And eventually win by removing all your stuff. And here's a full Fairylingus and off we go. So I think it's interesting that like they are the few, outside of like the Stompy decks, which have got basics on mono red, mono black, things like that. Jeskai really leans into it, and to a certain extent, like, you know, Death and Taxes, like, but obviously that being a monocolored deck, that obviously has that as well. But again, but actually talking of Death and Taxes, and a question that we had is utility lands, Jarvis. Okay, there's so many of them. Lands plays like 10 of them. You know, Caracas, the Channel lands, Wasteland, Rashad, and Port Blast. I mean, the list goes on. Like, you know, I can name you the utility lands till cows come home in the format. But these, like, you know, so a good example of this is Delver. When I started playing Delver in 2019, I remember I went back through my old decks the other day. I had a deck that had Crop Rotation Caracas in its sideboard because when I was playing Rug, because you wanted to get Caracas to deal with Grizzlebrand and Emrakul, but is an off-color Caracas a land? Like, you know, what's Bajuka Bog? You know, Bajuka Bog out of like lands or, you know, depths or Maverick or something like that. Wasteland, you know, all these. What? How do we view those? Because they're, you know, Sarah asked me actually before we started chatting, is Wasteland a mana source? And I was like, no, Wasteland's a spell. So in my head, then Delver's playing 14, 15 lands. Because to me, Wasteland doesn't cast anything. You know, maybe it casts a Murktide region occasionally, but that's about it. So it's interesting how we look at these like lands that are utility, and I think that with the uptick of the DFCs also, but like also the channel lands, they were like a good indicator of like, look what you can do. You know, you can put these in the land slot, so you don't have to make space in the spell slot, so you can play more things. So yeah, this is an interesting area. I think this is kind of, especially in Legacy, is very pronounced, but I think in Modern it's also quite pronounced also.
Yeah, so I guess I'll unpack that one by one. Obviously, like, there are a lot of utility lands in Legacy, and obviously they have varying degrees of power level. I would say with regards to Wasteland and Delver, the real question is how many cards do you have that cost, you know, a generic mana in the upper right-hand corner?
Yeah.
The more that your deck has, the more Wasteland is a land. So often in post-board games, if I'm slowing down and siding in 3-drops that cost that, I will treat Wasteland as land and not shave it.
Yeah.
If there are matchups where I don't want to, like, there might not be a lot of targets for Wasteland, I'm not siding in 3-drops, I'll shave down on Wastelands in a post-board game, because you're right, they don't cast much. They don't cast, you know, Dragon's Rage Channeler. They don't cast a Delver Secrets. They don't cast a Brainstorm Pond or a removal spell. So I think a lot of that is deck construction. There were times in, you know, Team or Delver, Rug Delver, however you want to put it, where I actually played Elvish Reclaimer for the sideboard crop rotation package as well. But Reclaimer also, you know, you can wash your Wasteland mana into activating it to go get those utility lands as well. I did this mostly when Wrenn and 6 was legal in the format, because it is synergistic. I also played a Waterlogged Grove because that's also synergistic with the deck. Made our deck very, very good and very consistent versus linear decks in a weird way that, you know, kind of you couldn't really do it any other way. Also having Bajuka Bog in a post-board game versus Reanimator meant a turn 1 Reclaimer. If you got to turn 2, they couldn't really do anything to you. Like, the game just got so difficult for them. So, great question. Wasteland, the more things you have generic mana sources, like generic mana costs in, the better it gets as a mana source. You can see this in Death and Taxes because it's basically a 1 to 5 sort of curve. There was a joke that the actual best Aether Vial deck in a long time for Legacy was Goblins, because of the fact that it went 1 to 5. It had Kiki Jiki and Siege Gang Commander at 5 when those cards were played in the past. You don't see those cards very much anymore because, well, it's kind of hard to justify doing that sort of stuff when you could just play a better Aether Vial deck, generally speaking. Not to, you know, try to anger the Goblins lovers. Of course, Goblins is a beloved deck, and it used to be one of the best decks in Legacy a long time ago. I would say it's just gotten harder for it to compete because it's hard for them to print a lot of broken Goblins. But yeah,
they're trying.
They are trying. The more generic mana costs, the better Wasteland gets as a mana source.
low curve, very color heavy decks might not be a mana source a lot of the time. With regards to tap lands, I would be very hesitant to count them as mana sources because the fact is a tap land is a high cost to play in Legacy. Like it does offset you a lot of tempo. Like this is why like people are like, oh, why doesn't your deck play Mystic Sanctuary? Or why does it play Mystic Sanctuary? Well, there are pros and cons of each. Mystic Sanctuary, if it was guaranteed to stay in your deck, would be a very, very broken card that you would always want to have access to. But the fact of the matter is sometimes you draw it and you really don't want to draw it, and it's basically not a card if it's in your hand.
Yeah. Tap Guild Gate Go is my favorite phrase. Tap like it's like your second land drop in our hand, and you're like, tap Guild Gate Go. And you're like, oh my god, I've lost so much tempo.
Then you've also got the fact that you can brainstorm a Mystic Sanctuary back in as another way that it then offsets.
Yeah.
So I guess it factors in how much deck manipulation you have as well. Right?
Agreed. Yes, a lot of that is kind of warped by manipulation. With regards to other utility lands that actually do tap for mana, like Rashad Port and Caracas and Death and Taxes, obviously it taps for white. Great, that's why you see Yorion play 4. You tend to see 60 card play 3 because that's basically the same ratio. It does basically the same thing. I have seen 60 card versions that play 4 as well. Certain cards would incentivize you to do that. Samwise, the Stout-Hearted is one card that's a good example of. Lauren of the Third Path in certain metagames very, very good with Caracas.
Yeah.
So specifically in Death and Taxes, I think Caracas I would count as a full-on mana source because it's on color as well.
Yeah.
Rashad Port, again, depends on what you're trying to do. If your deck has a lot of generic mana costs, then Port is a mana source essentially. It's not a colored mana source most of the time, barring something like Yavimaya or Riftstone Portal or Urborg. Then it might be. But again, those are very situational. Generally, Port is not a colored mana source, but is an actual mana source, is how I would put it.
Yeah. It's like, I think the mana denial is this weird, like, kind of spot where it is mana to a point, but it's not its primary function to be mana. It is trying to, mana denial, in terms of doing that. And it's interesting when you're saying about the tap lands, because I find it astonishing that in Modern that triumphs are everywhere, and we have time, and I think it's because we don't have the mana denial as we have in Legacy.
Yeah.
The amount of people who go, can we print Wasteland? I'm like, no, you will literally break Modern if you print Wasteland into it. I'm there going, give me Price of Progress just so I can punish these Manabases. But that's a girl can dream. It would make Burn too good as well. I'd be very happy. I'd be like, get you. I digress. But I think that it's interesting when you look at it, when you see, especially control decks trying triomes, and I'm like, how, like, do you want, like, I just don't understand the tempo loss. Like, I get it. I sort of understand it for control to a point, like for 4 color or 5 color, if you are really need to hit all your colors for God, I don't know what you're trying to play. If you're trying to play 4 Fairlingers, Bowmasters, Oro, Teferi, Narset, all in the same, live your best life. I mean, do what you want to do, and you want to play Wasteland. Like, I've seen those greedy, like, 5 color mana deck, Yorion mana decks happen, and I'm there going, this mana base hurts my eyes, because that to me isn't what is trying to. And they also will play utility lands, and I'm there going, there's a point where I think some people with deck construction, they push it, they see how far they can push the mana before it effectively is basically unplayable. And I think sometimes in blue decks, people like to use cantrips as a way to, we were talking about earlier, like, fix your mana. It's like, it will, the cantrips will help me fix my not the mistakes, but the decisions I've made in mana base and deck construction to make sure my game still functions, when in actuality that is a very high risk, high reward approach. And it's probably better to be a little bit more conservative and go, you know what, maybe you don't need 5 colors. Have you considered maybe 4? Maybe 3? Just, 2? And I think Control is the one that kind of pushes that boundary at times, and I'm there going, I would go to the Control players as to why you would need multiple colors to then do it, when other mana bases can make it work. Like it's strange because splashing, I'm like, okay, like your mana, but your fetches, fetchables can kind of probably do that. But that sort of is things like so. Yeah, I kind of question, things like. But I think it's interesting. Like utility lands, they are. I think there's definitely a push to have more of them. I think the channel lands are really good for the format, and I hope they do more of them. I think they're actually really useful. But I think there's a point where you don't want your deck to all be like, you don't want all your mana to be like utility. You want also just to be able to cast your spells. I don't want every land to be a freaking Beseiju who endures. I would like my occasion just tap a forest, play Elvish Reclaimer, and go. That would be lovely. So I think one question I had for you, Jarvis, this is more kind of like a bit more broad conceptual stuff. We also talked about sort of key bits of things. Is this idea of like when you look at a deck, like in terms of deck construction, and you look at it, you look at the 60 card, this is constructed, you look at the 60 cards, you look at the 15 card sideboard. One thing, I know Anurag Das kind of spoke about this months ago, maybe a year ago now, and this idea of like people should be doing the elephant method, which is effectively looking at a deck as a 75 in terms of how you put the deck together, what you're trying to build. This was an article, I think, from 2013. This is a very long time ago. This was a SCG Starseeds article, basically this idea of, looking, rather than it being 60-15, look at it as a 75 and you build based on that. I mean, obviously, Jarvis, if you know more about it, please elaborate. But that's sort of, for me, people tune their fine deck, but they don't tune their side, or they don't tune their sideboard together. So trying to make it as a whole, like I call it, like, to use a kind of research approach, it's like a bottom-up approach to deck construction rather than a top-down view to deck structure. So I don't know if you have ways that you think about it like that when you come to like build a new deck from scratch. Is it very like, do you think of it like this kind of inductive approach where you're sort of building from the ground up and sort of trying to look at it as a 75? Or do you kind of look at it more top down and go, okay, well, let's build the main deck, let's get the sideboard, and then sort of put it together and see what happens? Like it, or is it sort of like a contextually bit of column A, a bit of column B?
Great question. I do know the exact article you're referring to. It's by Zvi Mauschwitz, one of the greats. I actually think him talking about that method predates that SCG article, but I don't know where the older articles are. They're probably lost in the annals of some website. Rest in peace, the dojo, or TGG player, or whatever other site it was on. I would say that method is the platonic ideal of how you should build a deck. However, there are considerations for how you cannot get there at a point. So if you're new to a format, I think it's going to be very difficult to apply that method from the get-go. So if you're new to Legacy, you're new to Pioneer, or hell, if you're new to Booster Draft, you don't even know like what sideboard cards you want during the draft portion or the build portion that might be good. You have to get a critical mass of experience before you can apply something like that, is what I would say. So that's the most important thing. You have to understand the constraints of the format, and so you should get in some games with sort of stock decks, or what people perceive to be the best deck in the format probably is going to be helpful for you if you were trying to do something off the beaten path. Without that sort of knowledge, I don't think you can really apply a method such as Elephant Method very effectively, because you literally don't know what you're trying to do, what the enemies are, what your weaknesses are. There needs to be a critical mass. If it's also a deck you've never played before in any format, then it's probably worth, going over the basic play patterns and understanding what your goal in certain matchups are, which is part of the Elephant Method. But the way you can apply that method is, okay, I know my deck is not good versus, say, Tron, because I can never beat Oblivion Stone even if I Blood Moon them. That's something you can only see if you play a certain number of games, or you have a very good intuitive understanding of the format. Another example would be, okay, I'm playing lands.
I cannot beat combo because in game 1 they just kill me. So I need to take, severe countermeasures. Maybe this justifies me playing main deck Sphere of Resistance if the field's all combo. I generally don't believe that's the case, but you could see how someone gets there. It does make sense. But the flip side is, okay, my deck in game 1 is bad versus combo. I need to sideboard a lot of anti-combo cards to even raise it to 50%. Is this even worth it? Yeah. So that's part of the elephant method, to understand, okay, my deck doesn't really work in game 1. Can I, move the needle enough in games 2 and 3 to make it even? If you can't really, then you probably shouldn't. So a lot of those considerations come with elephant method. Of course, it's great. Of course, Z, put it very so elegantly. I don't actually know why it's called elephant. That's a weird word to use, I think. But it's really more the idea that your deck needs to have a coherent plan in game 1 and game 2 and game 3 in all of the matchups, if at all possible. And sometimes the plan is, this matchup is so bad, I'll just pretend it doesn't exist. It's fine. That's a fine way to go about, gaining tournament equity, because if you don't expect that bad matchup to exist that much, then it's okay to just, okay, we'll just pretend it doesn't exist, because the amount of work it would take to get it to, an even matchup in 3 games is, it would require the entire sideboard or whatever,
It's interesting you say that, because there's also I don't think it's a counter, but it's the sort of transformational sideboard, which I don't think happens as much anymore. But it's the whole take your 15 cards, take out 15 cards, put in a new plan, and that used to be a thing a lot more than it is now. I mean, there's obviously, transforming threats. If I know creativity, for example, because of I think I know that friend of the channel, Sean Goddard, when he was playing Creativity the Pro Tour, was playing Terastodon to deal with Tron, and to deal with Tron pieces and stuff like that. I kind of understood why, that is fine for a kind of change your threat base in terms of, but actual 15 cards in, 15 cards out, I think just doesn't happen anymore. I think that, and I don't know if whether that's because that just makes your deck, you then don't have answers to a variety of matchups and issues you have. You just have my deck doesn't function, so I'm just going to change it to a completely different plan. And I think it's probably something that used to happen a lot more, but I think as deck theory and the way decks are built, I think it's better to just have a diverse range of answers in your sideboard to do that, rather than just go, hey, I'm just going to change decks entirely. I don't know if that's still the case, or if there are some decks that still do that, but I personally haven't seen them in I've been the formats I've played, or in the years I've played Magic. I don't think that's a thing as much anymore.
I'm going to kind of count Mississippi River as kind of doing that. It becomes a Tybalt's Trickery deck after sideboard sometimes.
Yeah, but that deck's a meme.
Okay.
Mississippi River, look, don't get me wrong, I think Creative Technique and the Mississippi River deck is a happy place for the format, but it's also dies to a stiff breeze. That deck is it's basically the new Oops. Mississippi River for me is very much like the new Oops of the format, and it has the same challenges that Oops has. And also, I think Oops has that capacity, potential capacity of transforming into something else. But yeah, I think Mississippi River probably. But again, I think only really degenerate combo can probably get away with doing that sort of 15 in, 15 out kind of thing potentially. I'd be not to give one others.
I think it's interesting you bring that up. I want to push back against that a little bit with using some of the examples from the Pro Tour, the modern Pro Tour. There was actually a team involved Nico Boni, Daniel Gottschall. Their Rhinos deck, it was designed to cut all the Crashing of Footfalls postboard for Draneth Magistrate versus Living End. And that, I would say, is a transformational sideboard. And this is a key realization that the Cascade decks operate in a single way. Their deck operates in a single way. The Living End deck operates in a single way. If you put Draneth Magistrate in the play, their deck does not work. What they have to do is cast all of their things, and you can cast all of your things. Then it just becomes a battle of
who's better set up in an actual, deck full of overcosted creatures. And I would say the deck with Fury, Subtlety, Lore and Revealed is actually favored.
Yes.
As opposed to the deck that is basically, 4 mana, 4/4 fires, 6 mana, 5/7 reach, 6 mana, 6/4 tramplers. So I'm going to push back towards that idea. I think the real reason you don't see it very often now is the game A plans are so good nowadays.
Yes.
It is the actual reality. Like to use the Sean Goddard example, I view moving the targets around as not a fundamental shift in the game plan. It's just a fundamental shift in what happens when you cast your namesake card. I would say it's the same game plan, because if they remove your thing in response to your creativity, the same thing happens, which is nothing happens.
Yeah.
It's just, I think, the days of sideboarding, an alternative win con, it's not really as powerful as it used to be, because the gaming plans are so good. I think where you actually saw transformational sideboards more often was in Standard, where game 1, my control deck has no creatures, your removal has no targets. Okay, I'm Azorius Control. Here come in my 4 Archangel of Thunes versus your red deck.
Oh.
Okay, well, now you can't win because Archangel of Thune wins the game on the spot. Combined with Nyx Fleece Ram, you could see even Flock doing this to Jackson Cunningham famously.
Yeah. I've seen that matchup. I cry every time.
They used to happen in Pauper quite a lot as well. Tireless Tribe combo, when that existed, often ran
Inside Out, yeah.
Yeah, it ran a sideboard where it turned into a mono blue Delver deck after the board if you could deal with my combo really well. I won a ton of tournaments with that deck when it was legal. That thing never should have been legal. I'm just gonna double back on something really quick, kind of as an aside. With names like the Elephant Method, I've heard a story of why it's called that, but I am very aware it could have just been a post hoc justification for just a name that they gave it. Because there's this thing in chess called the Woodpecker Method as well, and I've heard a ton of different explanations of why it's called that. And it just turns out the guy who made it, his last name translates as woodpecker, if you translate it from language it's into English. But the story I heard is it's called the Elephant Method, because instead of just trying to build a 16 or 15, have you heard the idiom about a bunch of people touching different parts of the elephant and thinking it's a different thing?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, so you do that for all the different matchups, so then you bring it together into the elephant.
I see.
Is the story that I heard.
Oh my god. What is it with magic? Oh,
I mean, it's a really common idiom. It's a good one.
It is an idiom, but I'm also just there Magic players, stop taking all the idioms. We don't need 17 idioms. We have enough with deck naming conventions. I'm not even getting into that conversation today because, why is Cephalid Breakfast called Cephalid Breakfast? Who knows?
Because breakfast means combo deck, and Cephalid means Cephalid Illusionist. But kind of just to wrap things up a little bit and kind of put a bow on it. So, say you're someone who has been playing Legacy for a while, you've been net decking, doing little tweaks here and there, and you've kind of got some sort of idea for something you want to build and try. I'm thinking of how people were trying out different scam shells in Legacy, things like that. What are some best practices that you would recommend in terms of getting your mana base in order, so that you can give whatever cool idea you have the best chance it has to function? Because if your mana base isn't correct, no matter how good your idea is, it's never going to work, right? So are there some best practices you apply when brewing, when you were looking at the bug scam shell? What kind of things were you looking at tweaking? And just if you've got any good stories about decks you've constructed and kind of how you worked it out, this is kind of the perfect space, I think.
Great question. Obviously, there's a ton that goes into this. Again, I cannot shout out MTGOnCurve enough. I use it to spot check things if I'm not sure. If I don't have time for the cockatrice thing, I will just go there and see what the numbers look like, see if things are roughly in the right ballpark. of course, like it does some weird stuff with like leyline binding because it doesn't know it's actually a 1-mana spell. So its probability of being cast on curve is like 0, except that's not actually how the card works. So it does some weird stuff. It spot checking like that is good, but I would say in general, if you're not sure if your deck works or not, just add a land or two. It'll make it more consistent. I think nowadays the threats are just so powerful. Nowadays, casting it on curve will tend to kill your opponent more often than, okay, well, I need to draw one land. Oh, missed again. Can't cast it. Probably going to die now. I would say the games of where Screw used to beat Flood don't really happen anymore, because if you flood and you draw one game-ending threat, your opponent generally dies instead, is how I would put it. And it used to be that the games used to be scrappier, where there would be a little bit of time before the threat killed you. Like maybe you'd have a few turns instead of like basically just a 1-turn window to answer their thing. Now I think like the games are just so condensed or so fast. In terms of decks I've worked on that I have any good stories about, I would say most of the things I've worked on, I've tended to just look at it and say, okay, this deck cannot cast its stuff, so we'll add a few lands. That's it. It's actually interesting that find it interesting that you quoted Reed, because I think Kai Bood was actually the originator of that quote, which is I might be misattributing it or misquoting it slightly, but I basically think he said, "Oh, Americans don't like to cast their spells, and also Americans don't like to mulligan." So,
I mean, I've noticed it when I play. Like, it's just like, what? Why am I mulliganing? I'm like, mulligan. It's important. Please mulligan more.
yeah,
People don't mulligan enough. People don't shuffle their ponders enough. Do all these things. It's important. But yeah. So I think it. Is there any other decks that you've like? Is there like one deck that kind of for you where you like you've worked on it? You've seen it come to reality. You've seen other people try it, and then it sort of has, developed. Because I know, like, if we take Bug Scam, because it's obviously the recent innovation. There was like 5-6 people kind of trying different mana bases and moving numbers about, and eventually now I think there's I'm not saying it's a stock deck. I think that deck is still being developed and worked on, but I think it's interesting what people value in terms of how to cast their spells, when do they need it, how much colored sources do they need. I think some people were trying to probably get a bit too greedy with that deck when we played it on the channel, and we were like, "What? You don't need? Why do we need green? Like, do you need green? No, you don't need. You don't actually need green. Good luck. Let's get in." So it's interesting that, like, so for you, like, MTGOnCurve is like your, if possible, like your best friend in terms of just understanding how it works. So that's good to know. I had never used it, so I will now. Now I feel like I should learn how to use it. But we'll do a little demo after our conversation for sure. Is for you, and also a bit of a kind of on the best practices in terms of when you look at other people's decks. Do you kind of have? I think you kind of said of like, add an extra land or something like that. But do you kind of look at people's decks, like when you like look at net decks and you're like, why did you do that? Do you have like they didn't do, they could have added a land here that could have helped, or they, this could be done better. Like constructive feedback when you look at a list and go, oh, they have like quite a few, sources of mana. Let's add a land, see if that improves it. Do you do that process also, or is it just more kind of a mental check before you like test a deck?
Great question. I do look at a deck and try to think about how it'll play out, not just its mana base. Sometimes I'll see decks where the plans are too divergent. Like sometimes it's pretty clear that someone's trying to do too much in a deck, where you see like 3 half combos in a deck and there's no really way to staple them together. There's no like cantrips, no card selection. So it's kind of clear the deck won't work. Sometimes if I don't understand and it sort of does look like it should work, then I'll try it without really changing anything. In general, if it's someone I trust, I'll just try the deck and see what happens, and what happens. And if there are some notes I can give them, then that's great for them.
I would say I generally have a pretty good intuition about that stuff because I've, worked on, however many decks over, 19 years, however you want to put it,
Don't show your age,
it's been a
Jarvis.
long time.
Don't show your age, Jarvis. You still look beautiful and youthful as
Oh,
always.
no, if you ask T-Swift, I'm still 22, but yeah, just, I would say if you don't understand a deck and you don't have a good intuition, just try it, play against some of the major decks and do it that way. And then if you notice problems, write down what the problems are. Don't just, write it off as bad luck. There's I think this is something that people can generally improve on, regardless of deck building or whatever. Just write down notes about what happens.
Yeah.
We, in a lot of the Pro Tour testing I've done, it's evolved a lot over the years where we came to realize that the numbers don't matter that much. It's actually what happens in the games matters a lot more because win percentages can vary drastically depending on who is playing a deck and what actually happens in the games. But what happens in the games, it's going to happen to someone at some point, especially if you take note of it. And maybe that's a way you can improve the deck. Maybe sometimes it is, I don't think I have enough colored sources of this. Or what can happen is something weird like, I don't think I have enough win cons in this matchup, because they can just save all of the removal for my win cons and not counter any of my card drawing spells. If they literally just counter all the win cons, I lose the game. So it's stuff like that that's actually important to notice, and that that is something to address in deck building once you've noticed the problem.
Yeah.
We've seen that in Pioneer recently as well.
Right.
With mono green just stone braining blue-white control until they literally can't win the game.
Yeah. I think it's also, I think in Modern you can definitely see it as well. I think even in Legacy to a certain extent, you don't have, I think some people kind of go, well, I don't know how my deck lost, or I don't know. So it's like, well, actually just being observant, which is kind of like something we spoke about in our last video of just like what is happening in the games that is leading to the situations that you're in. Especially, I think for us, obviously playing decks that we're new to, or we're kind of coming into clean, you're just like, well, this is interesting. And we noticed it. I think we noticed it with Scam. We also noticed it with Mono Black of just like, that's interesting. Like that. There's a line that means that this doesn't happen or this. So I think just being, we spoke about last episode, but it's kind of brought up in. Be present, just be acutely aware of what is happening. I think that will help everyone a lot further. Not all the time. You don't there's mental power to play this game, and sometimes you can front load a lot of that work, or when you've done that. So I think with that being done, I think Sarah, I think we've covered our major points. Do you have any like closing thoughts, Jarvis? Like key takeaways, TLDR, if you've got this far, so that you can kind of share with our audience.
Yeah, I guess TLDR, make sure you cast your spells on time because the threats are really powerful. Try to envision your game plan for a deck in a matchup. That's regardless of format, mana base, whatever. Like this even happens in draft. Like, I think this game's going to go to decking by like turn 3 because it's a Dimir Mirror and like Lord of the Rings Limited, because nothing actually happens except everyone kills everyone's stuff and people cast card draw spells. So just stuff like that. I think identifying who the beatdown is or what's going to happen in a game long term is a really valuable skill and can aid in deck building. Like to use another example from Legacy, the 4-color control deck I think needs to play Wasteland, mostly because most of the 4-color control decks are soft to Karakas.
Yes,
is the correct way to think about it, and not that like it's a little bit greedy to play it, obviously, but if you're cutting a spell for the Wasteland anyways, it's not really that greedy.
Yeah, exactly.
I always think of Wasteland for decks where Urza Saga is a big problem for them as well.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah,
that's a Saga good card, ladies and gentlemen. So I think with that... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, like, we've mentioned MTGOnCurve a ton. Are there any other resources that you like to use that you want to shout out or anything like that?
Yeah, so in a lot of situations, the hypergeometric distribution is the correct way to ask a question, saying, basically, if I sample a bunch of cards from my deck, how likely is it that I'll find the result I'm looking for? Obviously, of course, you have to know how to use the tool, and there are times where people use it incorrectly, because there's a notion in probability theory that if you have two independent events, the probability of them intersecting is multiplying them together. In the hypergeometric specifically, a lot of people misuse it because the events aren't actually independent that they're trying to measure.
Yeah.
So, and then they end up overestimating the probability of success, which can lead to ruin, obviously. This is why you have to use MTGOnCurve to see if you can cast a multicolored spell, rather than asking each individual question, oh, can I draw a green source? Can I draw a black source? Because an easy way to see this is if you have Bayou in your deck, if you ask that question separately, it'll overcount for both of the cases. So that's why something like MTGOnCurve and hypergeometric are both useful. They answer similar questions in the correct way, is how I would put it.
Yeah, and I think when you've talked about strategy, that's a big thing I noticed, that people misuse stats sometimes. Like, they'll plug it into a hypergeometric calculator and kind of like end their reasoning there.
Sure.
Instead of being like, yeah, this has a 62% chance in a matchup where I'm like a 30-70 dog, so this is great here.
Yes,
Whereas
exactly.
if I was like 80-20, this would be awful, and I would mulligan it instantly.
Sure.
There's definitely,
Right.
yeah. Sarah told me about hypergeometric calculator. I did it. I was like, oh, these numbers are great. So hard. These numbers are wrong. I'm like, oh no, I did this incorrectly. It was so, but it's all good. Well, with that, folks, thank you, Jarvis, for hanging out. Obviously, we're going to do a little bit of a demo at the end, but I'm just doing little things. Jarvis, where can people find you on the internet? Where can they find you now?
Oh, I guess it's no longer twitter.com, it's x.com somehow. Fun story about that. Elon Musk tried to name PayPal X, and people told him it was an awful idea, and then now he finally got his way. But you can find me. You can find me on that website at jkyu06. You can find me at Twitch, Jarvis Yu. You can find me on YouTube, Jarvis Yu. And I'm also on Metafy. You can also email me, jarvisumtg@gmail.com, if you want to talk about anything Magic related. Always happy to talk to people about Magic. Always looking for students if you have any questions.
Just on like the studying thing, like if people do want to contact you for coaching, like what kind of rate should they be expecting? What kind of stuff do you like to do?
Obviously, it depends on if they're thinking short term or long term. Because obviously, long term you can sort of construct, a cohesive plan over multiple lessons. Short term, obviously, I can try to give insight, on a specific deck in a specific format, maybe common matchups, common sideboard plans, what really matters in matchups. Long term, just fundamentals, booster draft fundamentals, which I think. Honestly, I feel like if you learn how to booster draft well, that teaches you so much about Magic in general that's actually the way I mostly learned how to play Magic. I just played a lot of drafts, and I kind of banged my head against the wall to learn a lot of lessons. So maybe I can help people avoid, banging the head against the wall in a faster, less painful sort of way.
I definitely banged my head. I definitely did my banging against the wall phase of trying to learn how to play. I just get better at limited. It's like my one skill set that I need to improve on. Sean Goddard has happily said that he will help me with that, and that man knows the way around the limited format. So yeah, and obviously, folks, you can find us at the Legacy Gambit on Twitter, here, obviously on YouTube. We're doing some very cool stuff. Got some very cool guests. Got some very cool decks that we're playing. So until next time, just keep enjoying playing Legacy, have fun, and catch you guys later. Bye!
Bye!